Good morning, good afternoon, perhaps even good evening, depending on where this Wednesday finds you. I am Brian Komar. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability Programs at Salesforce, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Our focus, of course, is the new HBR article, The Evolving Role of Chief Sustainability Officers. They once focused on optics and reputation. Today, many are interacting with investors and helping set strategy. Now, the piece just came online last week and is hitting newsstands this week, so please be sure to pick up your copy. I will be exceedingly brief with my intros so that we can listen and learn from this amazing group, and really what an amazing group we have. First and foremost, Alison Taylor, one of our co-authors. Alison is a clinical associate professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. She is also the executive director of ethical systems. She is currently completing a book on the new landscape of business ethics for Harvard Business Review Press. And her previous work experience, of course, includes managing director at BSR and also a senior managing director at Control Risks. Alison holds a host of advisory roles as well. Also joining us is Robert Eccles. Bob, of course, our other co-author and needs no introduction. He is the definitive resource on integrated reporting, renowned expert. He is a visiting professor of management practice at the Saïd Business School at Oxford. He's engaged in research projects focused on corporate reporting, corporate purpose, engagement, stewardship, private equity. He's been a visiting lecturer at MIT, at Berkeley. He's a Harvard business professor, tenured, and of course, founding chair, board member at SASB and IIRC. And last but not least, Noel Kinder. And Noel really, is the epitome of the professionalization of the CSO role that is identified in this article. As CSO, Noel leads global sustainability at Nike, a team that is committed to protecting the planet and the future of sport so that all athletes can train, live, and thrive. Prior to becoming the CSO, Noel was VP of Sustainable Manufacturing and Sourcing, where he was responsible for collaborating with all of Nike's business units, contracted manufacturers and suppliers, and stakeholders and representatives from the NGO community. Welcome to you all. We are going to jump right into the conversation about the article, but we'll leave some time at the end for some questions from the audience. And so please go ahead and use the functionality to submit your questions. And my apologies on the front end in case we're not able to get to all of the questions. So let's dive right in. Alison, first, thank you so much just for the research and for your leadership in aligning businesses to people and planet. Interviews with 29 CSOs and 31 investors. For those who haven't had a chance to read the article yet, can you provide us a summary of the article?
Sure thing, and thank you, Brian. It's such a joy to be here and super excited to be discussing this important topic. So maybe I'll start by going back around 5 years or so when I was working in sustainability. And I started to ask a bunch of questions about what the sustainability role was in the company and what it was for. And I did not come up with any particularly good answers. There seemed to be no consistency in terms of how we thought about the role, no professionalization, no real clear concept of what this was really trying to achieve. To some degree, obviously, that's legitimate. Different industries will face different material issues, and so it may make more or less sense to put sustainability in marketing or risk or compliance or somewhere else. But I think the bigger problem that I was observing is what I might call a kind of everything everywhere all at once problem, where the sustainability team, the sustainability lead, was expected to interact with all stakeholders while the rest of the business interacted and thought about shareholders. And I started to ask questions about that, and I thought, well, that's very strange. because stakeholders, of course, are going to be basing their views of the company on the whole company, not their interactions with the sustainability team. Customers will have much more salient interactions with business development or sales, suppliers with procurement, employees with HR, and so on. So I started to just ask all these questions about sustainability as usual. And I really came to the conclusion that a lot of what was going on was that this role was really a sort of stealth PR role. And we opened the article with this assertion. A definition I very much like that is not from me is that this is really, we were treating sustainability as the paramilitary wing of the marketing department. So we're telling an appealing story, we're putting out a glossy report, etc. Very good reasons companies are responding in this way, not least the kind of patchwork emergence of ESG reporting standards, and then all these stakeholder demands, all these stakeholder pressures, all of which kind of drive this real isomorphism. They drive companies to kind of herd together and to try and tick the box on 40 things rather than to be genuinely strategic about sustainability issues. If we think of strategy as the art of choosing what not to do. So as a result, and I think this is still true today, if you go online and you look at most companies' materiality maps, they're really kind of everything is material maps. They don't give us a sense of differentiation on ESG issues between what's a risk, what's a value creation opportunity, and what's an impact that may manifest as a future risk where we need to put in place ethical guardrails. Instead, we have this sort of big amorphous bucket of ESG stuff and a lot of messaging. But two things have happened that I think dramatically changed this landscape. The first is the professionalization of ESG reporting standards, which mean that we have to think in a much more integrated way about financial reporting versus sustainability reporting. It's still often the case, if you read a sustainability report, then you read the 10K, it feels as if you're reading about two completely different companies. But that's not going to fly anymore, given the increasing regulation around this topic. And this also means that you can't treat sustainability as beyond compliance. You have to think in a much more integrated way about risk and opportunity. The second thing that's happened, of course, which no one in the US will be ignoring, is this kind of anti-ESG backlash. So that makes treating ESG as marketing far more problematic. And I think what's also happening is companies, to a great extent, are feeling caught between Scylla and Charybdis. There is a chorus of voices saying, ignore all this stuff. This is all woke. Go back to Milton Friedman, which is obviously not helpful. We're not in the 20th century anymore. But on the other hand, there's a chorus of voices on the other side saying, if any of your stakeholders care about this issue, you need to be doing something about it. That's not practical and it's not realistic. So now, I think as a result of these pressures, what we're really seeing is companies trying to focus and be much, much more strategic about what they mean by sustainability. And that then is driving this kind of professionalization, more seniority, more influence of the chief sustainability officer. A final point I'll make before I hand over to other panelists is that we found that this counterintuitively, perhaps, a lot of this is happening furthest and fastest in companies that are facing really existential sustainability pressures. So not the companies we think of as sustainability poster children, but the companies that really need to get serious about this stuff if they're going to survive. So the most advanced companies we're really seeing are in sectors like mining, even tobacco, where they really need to kind of think very carefully about the difference between value creation, risk, and impact. So we think this is super exciting. We think this is a really under-discussed topic. There's a real tendency to say companies are doing this and that, and not to think about all these challenges of how you actually make this work inside the organization. So Bob and I have put out a point of view and are very excited to hear what people have to say about it.
Wonderful. Alison, thank you so much for that. Noel, let's bring you into the conversation. Welcome. And again, thank you. Nearly 25 years at Nike and just an incredible career of service. So thank you so much for that. We'll dive into Nike's sustainability kind of efforts in just a moment, but just initially, I'd love just your reaction to the article. What resonates with what Bob and Alison have written?
Well, I think Alison touched on it, and Bob and I have connected a couple of times prior to writing the article. And I think where we've discovered ourselves to be kindred spirits was around the topic of substance. As you can tell from my history at Nike, I've only been in sustainability proper for about the last 7 years, and the prior 18 were really around leading operations in places like Vietnam, leading functions like sourcing and supply planning. And so when I came into this role, it was really with the intention of operationalizing sustainability. I know that's a little bit of a made up word, but I think it kind of gets to Alison's point that, if you're really going to be strategic about this, you really have to deputize the organization in service of the commitments that you've made. And you have to be very strategic and make specific choices that as a company are relevant and material, to borrow Alison's turn of phrase, and are going to drive impact at scale. And those are not trivial things to attack, particularly for a company the size of Nike. And so when I read the article and had the conversations that Bob and I had, I really gravitated toward that philosophy that this is about driving substantive progress versus being a spokesperson. Now, in all fairness, a part of my job is being a spokesperson for what we do. And so I don't want to take away from that, but I'm a firm believer that the communications role that you have as a CSO flows from the substance of the work that you do as a company. Yes. That's a really important kind of symbiotic relationship. And so when I do stuff like this, it's usually to talk about the things that we're actually doing to drive change, some of the challenges that we have in achieving those, but it's about driving that substantive achievement and kind of how we're integrating sustainability across the enterprise, how we're using our innovation engine to frankly change the product we make and ultimately scale those innovations so that they drive impact.
Wonderful. Bob, you've got decades of scholarship on corporate purpose and enterprise value. Tell us how the evolution of the CSO role fits in here.
So that decades of progress sounds like a code word for old, Brian. I know where you're going with this. So you didn't slip Wisdom. God, oh, that's nice. So listen, Noel, you're not going to be very happy about this, but I'm going to do the big reveal. 25 years at Nike, and last time we talked to you hadn't seen Air. Man, I've seen it. So, you got to get on, Noel, man. You got to watch. It's a great movie. Read our article and then go watch the movie Air. So I think that's important. Look, Noel and Alison have really covered a lot of substance. So what I'd like to do, Brian, is bring in a little bit more of a kind of literary perspective on this whole topic. And I'm going to talk about George Orwell's Animal Farm, okay? Because I think Animal Farm can be very informative to what's going on with the CSO role. As everyone will recall, in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, okay? And we've seen that in both the corporate side and the investor side. So how did it work on the corporate side? Well, there was like the really equal animals, like the CEO and the CFO and the CTO and the CMO, and they had like big offices with great views on the top floor. And then there were folks like, no, man, and they had like 1.5 FTEs to put out a little sketch sustainability report. And they're down in the boiler room, and the kind of CSO or the CEO has said to the CSO, like, I'm not going to trash sustainability. It's like a nuclear detente, but, don't take up too much of my time. And you had that same kind of Animal Farm situation on the investor side, where there was the first class animals. These are the boys and girls that allocate resources, that pick the stocks, buy the bonds. They're portfolio managers. And then you kind of had the ESG stewardship team that does the proxy voting. And they're kind of the second class citizens. I can't tell you, no, their offices were better because asset managers typically have better and fancier offices in places like New York and London than you guys have wherever you are at the West Coast someplace. But they were still second class citizens. And then things started to change, right? Research comes about how material ESG issues are important to value creation. Companies still need to do a better job telling the story. Investors start to incorporate it in their investment decisions, like other risks, need to do a better job. As Alison said, having sustainability reporting standards. I think the International Sustainability Standards Board is going to be the global baseline. See how the SEC and FRAG fits into that. So that's a very important step, right? Because you're trying to link, what Alison was talking about, you're trying to link, the CSO role to value creation, which means better connection to strategy, better connection to capital allocation. Same thing happening on the investor side. So you need the portfolio managers. They need to have a point of view about what they think the material issues are. have that dialogue with companies. And one of the things that Alison and I found, and this came up, in Noel's experience as well, very interesting, 5 years ago, and if you went to a CSO and you said, how are things going with your investor meetings? They said, we don't go to investor meetings, and then maybe 3 years ago, it's like every now and then we're the second-class citizens, we meet with the other second-class citizens. And now what you're seeing in its early stages, so I don't want to overstate this, now what you're seeing is that the CSO not only is meeting with the ESG people, and sometimes they're pretty good, and sometimes it's a tick-the-box compliance exercise, they're meeting with the portfolio managers. They're having joint meetings with the ESG team on the investor side, the portfolio management team on the investor side, with the CSO, with the CFO, with the investor relations. And the consequence of this is that everybody needs to become bilingual, and especially on the corporate side, CSOs, as Alison was suggesting, they need to learn to talk financial talk. You need to have the same quality internal control systems and assurance on the sustainability data for the financial data. Then the CFOs, they need to learn more sustainability talk and not just fob the question off on the CSO when someone asks them a question about some sustainability issue. And I think that's very positive. And I think this whole culture war thing in the United States, in fact, let me just say, Brian and I, had drinks yesterday. I'm in DC. I'm in DC to meet with Republicans. We're going to talk about, ESG here in DC. I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. In a funny way. I mean, I think some of this stuff was kind of crazy shit, but in some ways it's like good, right? Because there's been all this greenwashing on ESG, and it's going to save the world, it's going to destroy the world. No, it's material risk factors. We need to get it tied into value creation. So greenwashing on the part of asset managers, greenwashing on the part of companies. Now's the opportunity to make it much more authentic. And the CSO has an absolutely fundamental role in this. And you're starting to see this, the careers of the CSOs, we talk about it in our piece, they're not kind of the more traditional, out of kind of CSR, stakeholder engagement. They come out of procurement, they come out of innovation, they come out of R&D. You're seeing them reporting not just to the CEO, and sometimes that's kind of a, token reporting relationship, to be honest. They're reporting to the CFO. There's a lot to be said for that in terms of the tie to, quality financial systems, sustainability systems. And so, what we're seeing, and kind of, to be honest, what we're hoping to do with our piece, and, for this webinar, and thanks, Brian, for doing this, we'd like to see the acceleration in this role. And we would challenge any CSO out there to kind of think about the things that we're laying out. And these are principles, they're not kind of hard rules and things. To what extent, can you be following this guidance, learning from people like Noel, and upgrade the role in your organization? So with that, Brian will stop.
Yeah, no, love it. I want to zero in on a couple of things that you said. One, really this convergence from the enterprise standpoint and from the investor standpoint, and where that convergence really, increasingly hits is around value creation, right? And around measuring and communicating business value. And so, Noel, you work at a company that has a long history of being very, strong leadership in sustainability. I mean, going back to the mid 90s, right? And like Salesforce, Nike is aligned to science-based targets. Again, like Salesforce, Nike is committed to net zero. But even with that commitment, it's just critical, right? To be communicating the business value. And that can be very challenging, even with, I think, the standardized reporting. Certainly a harmonization of that will help tremendously. But I wonder if you might just share an experience or two from your team's work, where you've been able to effectively tie your sustainability progress along with driving long-term value creation.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They're absolutely intertwined. And I think you can't be effective as a CSO if you don't focus on what I would call the intersections of incentive between what you're trying to drive from a sustainability standpoint and your objectives as a in our case, a very big, complex, for-profit, publicly traded enterprise. But I'll give you two kind of main drivers for that. I mean, number one, sustainability is often just really good business. And I'll give you a tactical example. Air freight. Now, we don't use a ton of air freight as a company. We don't fly a lot of our products, but we fly a little bit. Air freight is significantly more carbon intensive than putting it on a boat. It's also incredibly expensive. And so you find that really easy intersection of incentive where you say, okay, well, if we can plan a little more effectively, if we can drop our reliance on air freight, we'll minimize our carbon footprint and we'll save some money. And there are examples abound of that kind of behavior. Limiting the amount of cardboard you use to ship product around the world. Our European team has been light years ahead of most of the rest of the business for decades in thinking of new ways to do this. How do you lightweight your boxes? How do you put more boxes into a container? Again, lower cost, lower carbon footprint. So I think those things are really, really important. And you have to create the culture that allows for that, for sure. And I'm fortunate to stand on the shoulders of my predecessor, who was in this job for a very long time and kind of helped instill that culture in the company. But consumer behavior is a driver too. We're a consumer products company where we pride ourselves on being an innovator. And so one of the things that we've been able to use is that innovation engine that we've had in place for 50 plus years. I do at least know that, Bob, even though I haven't seen it. and understand, kind of channel what the consumers are telling us. And consumers are telling us that they of course, they want product to perform. If it's on pitch, on the basketball court, wherever it may be, in a dance studio, they want it to perform. They want it to be durable. They want it to be uniquely Nike. They want it to be cool, right? Remember, our target market is generally skews younger than all of those of us on the panel. And they want it to be sustainable. And I think that's the challenge that we really take up. One of the teams that I'm really grateful to be able to work with is our advanced innovation team. And for many, many years, the innovation teams have had this mantra of make athletes better, right? They invent new platforms that make people jump higher, run faster, better cushioning for runners. In the last few years, they've shifted that mantra to say, not only make athletes better, but make the planet better for athletes. And so you're starting to see this intersection where the mission and the criteria have changed. And so you're starting to see things that perform better, are more durable, hit our cost metrics, and are more sustainable, lower carbon footprint, lower waste. I'll get in trouble if I get too much more specific than that. But the other thing, that the advantage that we have is that innovation engine, we know how to proliferate those things over time. And so there's, some of you may have seen Space Hippie. It's this kind of crazy, very unique aesthetic shoe that uses a ton of recycled content. And that was really unique in and of itself, but it wasn't a massive volume model. But what's really cool about that is the product teams then pick up those innovations, whether it's the upper material, the synthetic textiles, or the recycled content in the midsole and the outsole, and they take that across the line. And you see a little bit of a family tree, if I were to lay it all out for you. Like an Air Force One has some of those materials, a Pegasus has some of those materials. And so for me, that's really important, because we satisfy the consumer's urge to kind of have all those requirements met and be, kind of take them where they couldn't even imagine. Like, here's this overwhelmingly, obviously more sustainable product. But then because we're so big, we use our scale to then proliferate that. And in my view, that's really important, because then you're driving impact, right? It's not only kind of stimulating the mind of the consumer, but it's also stimulating that in a way that then drives impact at scale. And that gets to things like science-based targets and the more public goals that we've set.
Hey, Brian, do you mind if I ask Noel a follow-up question on that?
No,
because
please.
as you're talking, Noel, and we talked about this a little bit, but in the 7 years that you've been in this role, I mean, what have you seen in terms of the evolution of general knowledge and expertise and competence around sustainability throughout the organization, as opposed to just in the function itself?
Well, honestly, that's been a huge tailwind for me, Bob, and not something I really anticipated. When I first stepped into the role about 5 years ago, there was this kind of tremendous appetite from the employee population to do more. Now, again, I'm really fortunate to have come into this role at a time where we have this huge platform and history and foundation of decades of work in this space. But, as it became more of climate change became more of a media narrative, our employee base really started to care about this and articulate what their desires were, that they wanted to help, that they wanted to participate, and frankly, to push us to do more. That has been a really interesting fuel for the work that we do. And it's really kind of taken off like wildfire. I mean, I think maybe my misconception when I came to this role is that I had to be kind of the orchestrator of all of the activities that had to happen. The reality was I was the strategist along with my team to devise, like, what is the enterprise strategy for sustainability? Obviously work to identify the tactics and the performance management and the governance all the way up to the board level. That's super important. But what I found, to your point, is that people are just taking this and running with it. I'll share an anecdote with you. I have a friend in the product creation team. So the teams that actually design and engineer product. And they worked in the cleated, what we call cleated, which is football and baseball cleats for the most part. And it's lots of plastic, lots of synthetic goods, arguably not the most sustainable product that's made in the world. And they didn't have a particular target for this product category, but he came to me and said, hey, I want you to know, we've taken it upon ourselves to see how far we can push the sustainability of our products. And I said, really? Okay, cool. Why? And you don't have a particular metric you're trying to achieve. He's like, look, this is where the entire product engine is going, where footwear itself is going, and we want to participate in that. So I think the desire and the passion have been a huge driver. And then the obligation that we have is to be quantitative about what it is that we expect collectively the company to achieve, so that we give them some guardrails, right? Because passion without guidance can take you in the wrong place.
Yeah, and I think it raises a really important point about, regardless of where it reports into, the nature, the kind of networked, integrated nature of the role. And what that means from a skill set standpoint, from a competency standpoint, right? Because when you're working in a networked environment, influence versus command and control, right? Relationship management across the enterprise, both internally and externally, in addition to being able to administer and drive your own, kind of direct sustainability, carbon accounting, environmental kind of programs. And so I think it's a good question to go deeper on, which is around kind of competencies and skills. And as this role kind of is professionalized, I wonder, Bob and Alison, just from your conversations with the other folks that you interviewed, some of those competencies that are rising to the top. You've touched upon a few of them, but I wonder if you might just kind of zero in. I know there's some both current CSOs on the line and certainly some aspiring on the line, and I think they'd love to know your guidance on which skills to be honing in the days ahead.
Bob, do you want to take that?
No, Alison, why don't you take it? Because you've got kind of a better longitudinal perspective than I do because of that big study you did 5 years ago. And that's kind of the comparison you've seen. So why don't you run with that one?
Sure. So I'll get to your question in a second, Brian, but I want to just first of all pick up on something incredibly important Noel was saying that we don't fully flesh out in the article, which is this drive from employees. And this is what I see in the classroom every day. This is what I see in my MBA classroom. It's what I see in the undergraduate classroom. And then when I'm trying to give career advice to people taking sustainability courses at NYU, what we're increasingly kind of saying to people is, you don't need to sit in sustainability. You can have qualifications in marketing or procurement or risk or compliance, and you can be driving the sustainability agenda. So we're really trying to kind of flesh out this integration here. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the competencies CSOs need, I would say you need competencies in the team, not maybe in a generic sustainability or communication skill set. You need competencies in your material ESG issues. So we need more focus and we need more depth. So that would be one thing. Clearly, you need credibility with the financial department, but this is they also need credibility with you. So I think one way I would think about the CSO role is thinking about the long-term strategic future of the company and really encouraging those kind of core functions that may think in a more narrow way about risk and return. We're thinking about transformation. We're thinking about organizational change. We're thinking about the long-term future. We're thinking about how to respond to kind of shifts in social norms. So I think the most important qualification or skill set for the CFO today is credibility internally. You need to be able to sit in the C-suite with your colleagues. You need to have them take you seriously. I tend to think that the most successful CSOs are those that have deep internal credibility, that have perhaps worked in a different department for several years. I'm even hearing that now this role is being fought over by senior internal candidates, even if maybe they don't have that kind of depth in sustainability reporting that we've traditionally thought about, and people are kind of building their teams there. But what we're really kind of seeing is more budget, more credibility, more senior influence. And so you need to know the business inside out is the core point that I want to make.
Right. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bob.
Oh, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's a reflection of my own experience in particular. I've spent 7-ish years in sustainability, but all of my experience prior to that is product creation, manufacturing. So all of that kind of diverse experience, I like to refer to myself as a bit of a mutt from a career standpoint. That helps you understand how to blend what you're trying to achieve from a sustainability standpoint with what the other objectives of the business are, right? To your point, Alison, whether it's financial, operational, I'll give you a really specific example. We're moving to a digital first supply chain strategy, where frankly, we're well into it at this point. And part of that includes regionalized distribution within the United States and Europe. Well, one of the advantages of that, back to this notion of air freight, is that your product is closer to your consumer. So as I'm working with the chief supply chain officer, we're absolutely in alignment. I understand what he's trying to do from a distribution standpoint. He understands what I'm trying to do from a minimization of transportation and carbon footprint standpoint, and you find those win-wins. But you're right, if you don't have that experience as a CSO, it's hard for you to understand kind of what they're driving from a business standpoint and find those intersections. And then underscore your point about the team. I was really deliberate in the way that we set up our team. You absolutely have to have some very specific subject matter in sustainability, whether that's, in our case, water experts that have come from the semiconductor industry or textile experts. But what you really need at the senior leadership team is people who understand how to drive that agenda into those major functions. So the people that lead sustainable innovation, sustainable product, sustainability in manufacturing come from those functions. They have teams that have that expertise that back them up, but in order for them to be credible, to use Alison's term, they have to have the functional expertise to drive progress.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly the kind of the experience at Salesforce as well, this kind of hub and spoke approach where some of that subject matter expertise is in that kind of in-house sustainability team, but it is a networked organization where there are, multiple departments that are kind of part of that kind of a hub and spoke approach. So listen, I want to turn the conversation. We've been really focusing kind of on the human capital side of the role. As my friend Tim Lockey refers to it as the human stack. But I want to turn around.
What a cool technology term.
The human stack, right? The human stack.
Man.
Yeah, it's
I
a
like
good one.
hanging around
And there's a
with
lot.
tech guys.
There's a lot to unpack there. We'll come back to the human stack because it inevitably is always the most important part of driving change. But alongside that, and kind of helping to support that, of course, is the role that data and technology play. Now, at Salesforce, we have an increasing sustainability solution set, right? Most notably Net Zero Cloud for environmental accounting that's now gotten into integrated ESG reporting. But what strikes me, and certainly so many of my colleagues, as we're having conversations every day with CSOs and increasingly CFOs and CIOs, is how woefully under-resourced, these teams are, not only on the human kind of capital side, but on the technology side. And, what struck me reading the article was, number one is that they're here, at the center of it is this leveling up, is this need to be involved in conversations with corporate strategy, to be involved in conversations with investors and the board and the CFO. And so I wonder about setting CSOs up for success and how important it is to arm them with the same enterprise grade, data and evidence that other departments are coming to the table with. And so I just, and particularly around the backlash against impact washing or greenwashing, what's been the best, anecdote is showing up with data and evidence around, the change that you've made. So, ask all of you, maybe Noel, I'll start with you, but just, how important is it to the CSO's success to be able to bring that type of enterprise grade, data and technology or data and evidence to the table? What role do you see technology playing in that?
Well, it's incredibly important. In order for the teams to actually make the right decisions to change attributes of product or shipping methodologies, they have to have the data in order to support that. And that data is in service of, ideally, a quantitative target that you set as a business. So I'll give you a specific example. In the product creation space, so think the teams that design, develop, and commercialize footwear or apparel, we have a platform that we've created internally called Impact ID. And that basically takes all of the different sustainability attributes of particular materials so that they can kind of mix and match and say, okay, well, if I pull this material in, what does it do to the overall carbon footprint? It's not perfect, but it at least gives them a framework to start to make some of those decisions at an enterprise level. And it's woven into just kind of the regular drumbeat of the product creation process within the systems that they currently use so that those teams can make the appropriate decision in service of those kind of otherwise enterprise targets. They understand what their role in achieving them is. From a technology standpoint, you have to be integrated, right? I mean, to the commentary around reporting, we're being regulated into more rigorous reporting. We're fortunate that we've had 20 plus years of voluntary reporting and progress in terms of progressively more assurance as we've gotten closer to the regulatory timelines. But you have to be integrated from an enterprise standpoint, particularly if these things are going to wind up in your Ks and Qs. The standard's pretty high. And so it's kind of a non-negotiable for the data to be on par with other enterprise data and integrated into your ERPs in a meaningful way.
Can I ask, while we're talking about technology, can I ask you youngsters a question, Brian, that's from our discussion the other day? It's like,
Sure.
I think you guys still get carded when you go to bars and stuff.
Yeah.
Let me see. I think actually, the CSO, that used to be like the ceiling. I think you're going to see people that go through the CSO role and become CEOs. So, we'll see if that turns out to be true. So we posted our article on LinkedIn. All I know about on LinkedIn is how to post an article. Then you get all this random shit that happens and stuff. And, most of the comments were okay. And then some people whined about the artwork in the article. I don't even know where that's coming from. Then this one guy goes, oh, yeah, sustainability. Of course, you're thinking about AI. And I'm thinking, I know what AI is. And we talked about it yesterday. So, Alison, help me with this. I mean, I get the technology stuff, I get the standards, I get the better systems, but is there any overlap between all this AI stuff and sustainability? And what is it?
The short answer from our perspective, by all means, is yes, and we'll have a follow-up webinar and series on that exact topic. I think it's like most tools, right? There's absolutely no doubt that there is an incredibly important value-added role here, and as an accelerator, we talk about kind of materiality assessments and being able to assess, where organizations just, impacts are enormous opportunities to help identify in the prioritization of kind of materiality, in the first place. So by all means, and in fact, at Salesforce, we have our kind of annual again, this isn't about us, but Bob, you asked the question, at Dreamforce, our annual conference, we'll be doing quite a bit on that topic and the intersection of ESG, sustainability, and GPT. But please, Noel and Alison, by all means, your own thoughts on the intersection of AI and sustainability.
I'll defer to Alison on this one.
I think all these tools are helpful. Again, we're telling a story of the business getting it. The business needs the data to get it. A lot of the problem with sustainability historically has maybe not been that there aren't risks and opportunities, but that we're not looking, we're not measuring. Maybe we're not measuring avoided costs. We're not measuring the value of increased employee motivation. We may just not be looking at the most kind of important things. I loved what you were talking about, Brian, in terms of because it speaks to what I talk about in my book as well, the wider evolution of the organization. So you cannot maybe as leaders impose agendas from the top down in the same way. We are shifting to more kind of network open systems organizations where you have to drive influence, you have to galvanize employees, you have to give them the data and tools to make decisions. A very interesting tension, I think, in this field in general is, right, we always talk about the long term. We always say over the long term, the business case for this stuff is very, very well demonstrated. But I don't know about you, things happen to me every 5 minutes and I'm like, I don't see how any company can plan. What we need to be able to do is kind of react in a nimble way to keep a North Star, to keep a strategic goal, but then empower the business to make decisions on the fly and to kind of drive change. So the long-term and short-term seem in tension. And I think the way to resolve that is by getting the data and getting the tools into the core business and then thinking about how to get that sustainability mindset into the core functions. And so maybe the way to think about the Chief Sustainability Officer role is a role really driving organizational transformation and organizational change.
Amen.
Could I raise just one other thing, that Noel touched on, and then we can open up for questions. So I had a call this morning with a good friend of mine, Bob Hers, who was chairman of FASB for a couple terms, and we're talking about the sustainability standards and the COSO framework and how the role has evolved. And he's on a couple of boards, and he was talking about how that's changed in terms of how often and what the nature of the interaction is between the CSO and the board of directors and kind of what the governance is around sustainability. So maybe start with you, Noel, and then Alison can kind of flesh it out. How has that evolved at Nike in terms of kind of board and sustainability functions and kind of how they talk to each other?
There's kind of the governance structure overall.
Yeah.
So
and how often you meet with the board and stuff like that, because I know you.
No, we've had a board function. We've had a board committee focused on sustainability for, I believe, more than 20 years, which is really helpful to me. So I go to them every quarter, twice a year. Every third board meeting, we go through a deep dive on our externally facing targets, how we're progressing against them, what obstacles we see, do we feel that we're going to achieve them or not. And then very soon we'll start thinking about sunsetting our 2025 targets and thinking about what our 2030 targets look like. Now, some of one of those die have already been cast. We already have science-based targets for 2030, so we'll just be updating them on that. But the board is super engaged, and they understand the materiality of all of these issues to us as a company. What precedes the board discussion is a discussion with John Donahoe, our CEO, and his executive leadership team to kind of go through the same process. And then we run I'd call it quarterly business review, where we are really laser focused on those targets and how we're achieving them. I should say that we have 13 enterprise targets in sustainability that span carbon, water, waste, chemistry, et cetera. Those 13 targets are underpinned by about 80 different functional targets that, like I said before, kind of deputize the company in service of achieving those higher level targets. And so that's what the point is. If you start at the lowest level of granularity, once a quarter, we'll go through the progress. We'll talk to the functional teams. How are we doing? How are we not doing? Where do we need to course correct? Are we off track in a way that we won't achieve the target? And then that cascades up to the executive team and ultimately the board. But our board's had a really good rhythm for a long time in that space and has built pretty good muscle in terms of engaging in these topics, understanding what the risks are to our business and kind of what the future looks like.
So listen, thank you, Noel. Thank you. And we won't have time for all of the questions by any means. We'll try and answer some of them online. I think that'd be a great way to continue the conversation. And some of them we've already addressed just in the conversation, particularly on where the role fits and sits and whatnot. But maybe one question is really around regional differences. And particularly, CSRD, speaks to both single, double materiality and just wondering, Bob and Alison in particular, just through and Nike is a global company, but just regional differences that you've seen in terms of prioritization or kind of the positioning of the role.
It's a really good question. I mean, at a very high level, we wanted to make this, kind of global in terms of the interviews we did. And to be honest, it's really hard to find CSOs in Asia. There's none in China. I've got friends in China and there's none in Korea and maybe there's a few in India. So this is kind of a Western world phenomenon, right? There's some good, very good ones actually, and, in Brazil and stuff. But personally, Alison knows more CSOs than I did in terms of kind of this broad pattern and trends in the role. I didn't see any big difference between, the US and Europe. There's this kind of thing about how Europe is more advanced. It's kind of got more regulations, but, kind of the character of the role and the importance of the investors. I didn't see any big differences there. I think the reporting aspect is because all of this is so new, ISSB and the CSRD and FREG and all that. I think there's big challenges around interoperability. I think there's going to be kind of more pressure on European CSOs because they're going to have to basically use both. And then how do you kind of harmonize all this with GRI? But, companies like Nike, you only need $250 million in revenues in Europe, and you have to conform, to the CSRD as well. So at least I don't see any big pattern of differences. Alison, do you?
The only obvious point would be the fraught political context here, which I think strikes a lot of Europeans as deeply strange. I think there are a lot of things that are points of debate in the US that Europeans just find bewildering. And then we have very high stakes debates in this country. The US has a particularly fraught history with racism and DEI issues. We have issues with reproductive rights. We have issues of gun control. So maybe one of the differences is this kind of politicization of the issues in the US. I don't think that's particularly good news for the country or for companies in general, but it is helping to kind of drive this rigor and thinking more about speaking up and more about how you use your voice on public policy issues. This is a kind of Trump administration legacy issue where companies, for very good reasons, were drawn into taking stances on these controversial political topics. And so here I think we're having maybe a more fraught and high stakes conversation about the role of business in society, what we're really expecting as corporate governance parameters, what we're not. And this is playing out with this very interesting, which Bob is on the front lines of, this very interesting kind of politicization of ESG debate. I think the CSO role is more long running in Europe, but maybe because the stakes have become so high in the US, we might now see companies kind of taking a very different approach because they've got to deal with this unbelievably fraught external risk landscape.
I mean, Alison raises, we don't have time to do it on this, but this is a topic. So yeah, the culture wars are incredibly entertaining. You people in Europe, you don't know what you're missing, man. We're having so much fun over here. But this question of companies, we talked about this on the other day too, Brian. Companies and the CEO taking a stance on political issues. Should they? When should they? What's the process by which they do so? Is it the CSO? Is it different if it's the founder CEO or incumbent CEO? Is it approved by the board? I mean, Alison is right. It's an incredibly important topic. It gets to the core question of the role of business in society. Leo Strine, Alison, as you know, has written about this. I don't have any ready answers on it, but I think it's a critical issue, and as we address it, CSOs are going to be involved.
Yeah, no, you bet, Bob, and that I think is a great plug for Alison's book when it comes out, because I have no doubt that the nature of business in society is we're at one of those moments, and can't wait for the book to come out.
She can't either. She can't.
I know.
How you doing, Alison? Have you finished it yet? Every time I talk to Alison, next month.
I think that's going to have to be the last word. But just in summary, the headline here is that the CSO is rapidly being transformed. We're witnessing an overall prioritization and formalization, elevation, increased authority, speaking corporate strategy, speaking with investors, increased focus, prioritization, integration, increased collaboration, and then of course data and technology, and so increased role for digital transformation. The CSO is a pretty remarkable person, a pretty big change agent. I think that's right, and we certainly are huge fans of the sustainability teams. And so if there is anything we can do at Salesforce, please don't hesitate to reach out. I just want to say a huge thank you, Alison, Bob, and Noel. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the folks tuning in. Thank you to our own team at Salesforce. Carmen Dowell, you're a rock star. And with that, would just ask folks to have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this, Brian. Good to see you, Alison. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.